Well, hello everyone. We are back for another Other Ink Thursday, and this time I am joined by James Kerr of Radio James Games. You're about to hear his lovely radio voice. Hello, James.
Oh, don't put that much on my voice. But th Thank you, Matthew. Hello. It is wonderful to be here. I'm a first-time guest, many-time viewer.
Right, I think you may be the first fan that's been on the show.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love the indie space is the for tabletop role-playing games is the bread and butter of my mind. It's where a lot of my thoughts live and play, and I'm happy to contribute.
Excellent, excellent. Um, so we were having a lovely conversation, and then you said something that is like, okay, now we got to turn on the recorder and we got to get this recorded. So one of the first questions that I always like to ask people, and especially people who haven't been on the either the Wet Ink or the Other Ink Thursday shows, is how did you get into gaming at all? Like we were what we were talking about is the pyramid of amateurism at the bottom, and then trying to get up into the next level and like sell things that you make, and this goes for all crafts and stuff like that. So what was your start? How did you get into the creative bug? I don't know. What is your why do you
Well,
make stuff? Why do
I'll
you make
try
stuff at
and
all?
I mean, there's how I got into tabletop role playing games, and then there's why I make stuff, what drives me to make stuff, which
Sure,
I feel
start.
like are kind of two separate things.
Sure,
I
do it.
started in gaming like a lot of people my age in a smelly, smoke-filled basement in the 90s, uh, playing the ampersand game of a kind of mishmash non-edition that was being run by the person at the time, and I thought it was fine. It was interesting. It was neat. How I started taking it seriously is I fell backwards. This is going to sound really dorky and terrible, but I fell backwards through Transformers because I wanted to make a Transformers role playing game. And so I don't know, Matthew, how dorky you are, and if you know what I'm talking about when I say these things. But on
Look,
the
I
back
had
of the
GoBots, I had Transformers. I know what you're talking about. Like
on the
there
back of
were
the
many epic
Transformers,
battles had.
on the back of the box was the tech spec, which gave
Mm.
stats and told you what weapons and things they had. And I got a bug in my brain at some point after I was in a regular game of a bunch of different stuff, and I was like, "What? Can I not just come up with a way to take this tech spec and have it be the character sheet?" And so I formed a role playing game around that and started tackling some interesting design aspects because mostly out of dissatisfaction, right? Like dissatisfaction and spite are like the main creative drives. Uh, and I thought, well, none of the games could ever do this. Like another role playing game couldn't do this because I really wanted the different modes of these transformers to feel different. I don't want like turning into a car to be like an activated power. And I noticed that's exactly the route that Renegade went recently with their publication. What I did is I used the tech specs so you could use it out of the box, so to speak, and it had numbers, and those numbers, the stat numbers changed when you went into a different mode. So you became like a different character. So you actually felt different. And I thought, oh, that's really cool, but I can never sell it, right? Because
Sure.
it's somebody's IP. Like I don't even want to pretend like whatever. But I it somehow found its way on the internet. I'm not even sure how. I found it on Reddit one day, and and I had a box.net link or something, and it had been downloaded something like 8,000 times, and I was getting emails from people in the email that I put in the little booklet, asking me questions from all over the world, and I thought,
See, this is I'm going to interrupt and say that like this is like, oh, it was just a little thing that I did, but I did have it on the internet and I did have a way to contact me if you liked it. Like it's not a little. I was
well,
imagining that you had like a binder, like there was one copy of this game in like a manila folder. It was like you put it on the you were so professional from the start,
Well,
James.
I was already using InDesign for the job that I had at the time,
Mm,
and I thought it was fun to lay things out. And I didn't know really what I was doing yet, but I thought it had enough traction and enough people were interested that I was like, oh, can I do I want to express myself in this way? Because I was doing radio and a part of the small non-for-profit campus community radio station that I was program director at the time was doing a yearly kind of a yearbook zine every year. So like I did like 8 publications that I was laying out as a summary of the broadcast events. And eventually one of those was a Transformers game book. and and then I thought, oh, do I so what kind of other stuff can I do? And I shamelessly abused my friends' time, uh, like my friend group, because I was in a weekly game for more than a decade, um, and just kept throwing systems at them. And I don't I never had a great success rate. I was talking about this in the IGDN room the other day. Was like I have about 5 failed systems to every one that kind of like flies because I'm always doing weird stuff, and it's it can work. You never really know what something is going to be. If you're doing something that's a departure from the way mechanics are traditionally structured, it's hard to tell if it's going to have wings until you get it to the table, right? Because somebody will
Sure.
say something stupid and blow the whole thing up. Uh, so so it has to pass that like stress test, right? And so I kept doing that until I had a funny idea of doing like I just looking around the landscape of tabletop role playing games at my dissatisfaction of what they could do and what they couldn't do. Somebody was making the joke the other day, you don't go into a Home Depot and demand a milkshake. Well, if for as a comparison for you can't get Dungeons and Dragons to do everything. Could you technically make a milkshake in a Home Depot? I mean,
Probably.
maybe. I mean, maybe you could buy a milkshake maker off the Home Depot and they might carry milk and like you could sit there in the aisle with an extension cord making a milkshake, but it's definitely not ideal milkshake making. So I didn't have a way of expressing a lot of the games that I wanted to bring to my friends, and so I started making systems. And that's how I got involved, and then I transitioned from radio into publishing, which just made me use InDesign all the more. And then my games started taking on a little bit more polish in terms of how they were being designed. And then I ended up freelancing for Pendlehaven Press, um, doing writing and editing and page layout, and then eventually project management and then development for them. And I published 6 or 7 books. I don't know, it's hard to tell at this point. 6 or 7 books with them. One of which was co-authored with fantasy author Ed Greenwood, who
All right.
lives right by me. So we were, it was a bit of shameless convenience because he's just like an hour away. So we go carpooling sometimes.
Nice.
Um, and and yeah, he gives I I get I get to needle him about all kinds of awful stories. Um, so yeah, I've gotten to publish. I've been fortunate enough to be able to publish, and through the wonderfully supportive community that is the Indie Games Developer Network and the Indie Press Revolution and other small distributors, I'm able
Well,
to
and
do
and
that
your
from
friends along the way. Like, I mean, it
yeah
sounds like you had kind of an ideal situation if you're like, I've got ideas, I've got a built-in playtest group that meets regularly. I learned in design on my job. Like, it's like a almost a perfect storm of opportunities to, like you say, stumble in to the to doing it.
yeah. I don't know how actually perfect it is or how just laying it out like that makes it look that way. But
Sure, but that's the
yeah,
sense you make of it at this point, right?
yeah,
Like
exactly. That's the truth that makes sense from this perspective, I guess, right now. But yeah, I've been really lucky. I could not have done it without my home group of friends. It's true. I had to expand beyond them. I've run a lot of convention games, and it's really important to run for strangers because you can't couch yourself on in jokes and like shorthands, like even
mm,
in thought wise shorthands. But this gets back to what we were saying um, before we started recording. Why do you do it?
hmm
I mean, to me, it's a medium. It's an artistic medium, just like a lot of others. But I really like that it's a social artistic medium. Writing a novel is very solitary, or even painting is very solitary in many ways. And I really like that it's a collaborative artistic medium. You just have to set up the framework. It has to make sense, and then the actual act of doing it, which is only part of the whole package of what it is,
Right.
uh, is enjoyable and social. It's not isolated, and I really like that. And so, what am I? Why do I feel driven to do it? I feel driven to do it because when I look at the design space of what has been done and what has been achieved and what kind of experiences people can have, it seems like it's only a sliver of the map. Like the whole of tabletop role playing games is in a fog of war, and we've got this little corner down here that is illuminated. And people say, "Oh, well, that's all of tabletop role playing games right there." And I'm like, you read one incredibly interesting design document, it can blow that entire perception out of the water. There's so much to do creatively, and I don't just mean in terms of mechanics, but in terms of like diving into genre conventions. And we're only
Mm,
talking about the genres that we can lazily crouch back on, right? There are untold combinations and
right.
weirdnesses that can happen. Like the very fact that Weird West has become kind of a subgenre in tabletop role playing games is astounding and interesting. You know, um, like we don't have. There's maybe one or two graphic novels or movies about cowboys and aliens being together, but like there's a freaking 10 tabletop role playing games of
Right.
different and varying
Yeah.
interest. Not
That
that
is
I
an interesting example of that phenomenon. Like you get obviously like I mean flagship companies getting flagship IPs, and there's a ton of sci-fi games that are all based on the biggest movies that are in the industry or whatever. Um but then yeah, like and you mentioned Renegade already, like they've got their like all the 80s cartoons that you love are now playable as RPGs. Like there is a lot of I don't know, synergy isn't exactly the word I'm looking for, but there's a lot of like the biggest media properties get turned into role playing games. There's a new Monty Python game, and they have like a funny title for it that says it's not a role playing game, but that's part of the joke. It's a role playing game. So, but then yeah, like there are some places where games got there first, right? Or not first, but like because
well, games are, I don't know if first is as important necessarily as games are going deeper. Games are
mm,
developing these ideas in a lot, tackling them in a much more interesting and in-depth way than other artistic mediums are, and it's coming out of a social medium, which I think is fascinating and really interesting. And that's so whether it's mechanical or whether it's setting or whether it's just design and layout, because some of these role-playing game books are beautiful. And they
mhm,
don't even need to be beautiful in terms of there's a lot of illustration in here, but some of them are works of art just unto themselves.
right.
And uh, and I think there's a completely legitimate form of appreciation in the hobby that is, I got this cool thing and it makes me think interesting thoughts. Like you don't. I definitely design games to get to the table, and the real action is in what happens in your head. But what happens in your head could happen without the table. It's wonderful to read tabletop role playing game books and imagine and be like, oh, that's a way of looking at the universe. Like
Mm,
it's a conceptual universe. It's a closed circuit universe. It's kind of a manageable universe. But that's the way we're going to look at it. That's really interesting. Like what if you had a world where trust was everything, where trust was the central mechanic, where trust was the thing that could be turned against you. Nothing
mm.
else really matters. It's just all comes down to trust. What does that mean? What does that mean for relationships? What does that mean for power dynamics? What does that mean for play?
Sure. I mean, that's
And,
that's a powerful hook right there.
well, that's just one of them. I was thinking of the Mountain Witch. I don't know if you know the game. It's a
No, that
Forge game,
okay.
and it's a wonderful example of like it came out of a lot of excuse the term, but like theory wankery, because you could definitely go too far down the theory hole. And it was a Forge game, and it was flash in the pan. It was published uh, to a surprising success from this one guy who just had never really done much other things. And then he did a Kickstarter for a new edition, and it made way too much money, and then he disappeared.
Hmm.
So the Kickstarter didn't end up happening. So maybe or it never got fulfilled, uh, which is a I encourage you to look into it because there's a lot of fun rumors about the topic. But the point is, the mechanics of it were incredibly interestingly refined. You are samurai and you are going up a hill. At the top of the hill is a witch in a castle. You may never get there. That's not really the point. The point is that you've got a score for each of your other player characters that is an investment in trust. And every round, you move that score up to say that you trust them more or down. And the point at which you betray them, you can use the trust you have in them against them.
All right. I mean, that's that that sounds like such a I mean I come from I come from a very crunchy background myself with role playing games where there's like big character sheets and you're going to roll your skills and the best thing is when you get to that level up and you get your skill becomes 2% better, right? And you go down this character sheet and your this skill becomes 2% better and this skill becomes 2% better and this skill becomes this is a weird skill, this becomes 6% better, right? Because it's a skill you can learn faster or whatever, and that's like built into the rule or whatever. And you never we I mean role playing was like, whether you used your big gun or your sword, like that was the role playing depth that I and obviously I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but like that is what you just described about like there's an the journey, the destination doesn't matter, the origins doesn't matter. What's now is you're on a mountainside and there's a trust thing, and like you will inevitably betray people, and that is the currency of the like that is such a different kind of game than the kind of games that I grew up with. And there are so many. We were talking before about how many games there are on itch, before we started recording, like on on itch.io. There's just thousands of games that nobody has ever heard of, and like only 7 people have ever played, and they're all like that, where they're like one little weird thing. Is that a game? I don't know. Write it up as 2 pages and there it is, and now it's a game, and maybe people will play it. Again, I'm
Yeah.
speaking hyperbolically, like there's
Yeah.
plenty of
Like
people who have played these games on the internet, but like
oh, a lot of games don't necessarily get played, and that's not necessarily to illegitimize them, right? And I'm not holding up the Mountain Witch as some kind of glorious game. People have opinions on it. Some people don't want to do PvP and whatever. But the point is, it's a very different experience from
yeah.
what if you were in a world where your big choices were between knife and gun, which can be made to be a very interesting choice, right?
You have 2 stats, knife and gun.
Like or like Honey Heist is a great example,
Mm-hmm,
Criminal and
mm-hmm.
Bear, right? Not to say that all games I think should be lightweight. I mean, you prefer crunchier games.
Oh, I don't prefer them
You
now. I just that's my baseline. I've come away from them, but it's my default still because it's where I started from. So
yeah.
there's
So
like a
like my point is that I feel driven to explore what's out there and conceptually that is unmapped, and
hmm,
because there's just so much to do. I'm really encouraged by the fact that I mean, it's a blessing and a curse that the industry has kind of a few different kind of core concepts that it can sometimes couch on design wise, like um, like Powered by the Apocalypse is a really friendly system for people to hack and do
hmm,
other things with, and that's great because it means people can engage with the design space without needing to reinvent the wheel. I would much rather reinvent the wheel personally, but I know that makes it a harder. It often makes it a harder sell because
hmm,
conceptually it can be a leap for people if they're. I find that this happens a lot with people coming from having only played Dungeons and Dragons. Is they think about specifically like since third edition, is they think about how do you segment in-game behavior? How do you
hmm,
interact as a player to character? Oh, well, the world, even if it's unspoken, the world is divided up into the idea of committing an action and doing a move and maybe doing a little other thing as well, right? And that's how they kind of segment possibility. Other games segment possibility completely differently. and I've seen a lot of people coming from the conditioning of Dungeons and Dragons just lose their mind if a game is one action per turn. No, you can just do one thing, then we're moving on. you know, and so it can be a challenge sometimes dealing with the ingrained perceptions of people of what is a role playing game. But I think it's a worthwhile challenge. I think it's like just
Yeah.
like there are movies that challenge what is a narrative arc. There can be role playing games that challenge what is what is the way that we interact with this social agreement
Right.
that can be in a different way.
Yeah. There's certainly we've touched on a bunch of different stuff here, and I'm not sure that there's a through line to the postulating that we've done here. And so I'm going to try to pull it through, and I want to pick up on a couple things that you said, and then we'll kind of move into talking about kind of your newest project, which is I should be at the time of the viewers watching this live, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But you mentioned that you like weird systems and you like to design weird systems. So I talked to you very briefly when we were together at GenCon last year about Fight to Survive, which is your uh, legacy characters picking up the mantle of the martial arts school and fighting other people, and you described it as like sort of a not as a paper rock scissors kind of thing, but that's how I've continued to think of it, where there's like well, it's not even paper rock scissors, there's like a you described it as sort of like when it's narratively appropriate, the fight escalates to the next level, and there's sort of like a scripted like escalation process. And I may misremember what you said, but tell us, is that a weird system that you designed because you were trying to explore something in particular, or
Yeah,
is that something you borrowed from somewhere? Where did that come from? Tell us more
well,
about that game.
the game is called Fight to Survive: Role Playing Martial Arts Meets Heart, and it is an urban, gritty 20th century martial arts game. And I designed it the way I did because I wanted to satisfy a few criteria. One was I was watching Bloodsport, the 1988 Jean-Claude Van Damme film, and there was a scene where he's on the bus and on the Hong Kong. I don't know why he's taking the Hong Kong bus, but he's on the bus and he's just his friend has just been beaten up by the bad guy, and in the ring, and he's like remembering Jean-Claude Van Damme is remembering that trauma, which just happened 5 minutes ago, and so we're not talking like high cinema here, and there's a Stan Bush song in the background singing like "On My Own," and he Jean-Claude Van Damme turns and he sees the reflection of his enemy in the window. Oh, but the enemy's not there. So he's clearly very uh, occupied by thoughts. And I thought, this is not high cinema, and this is not generally considered. This genre is capable of great storytelling. What an interesting little exchange that is, and an emotional resonance the movie has. You can say that it's not high acting, but like there's
Yeah,
a reason why people keep sharing Jean-Claude Van Damme being like
it's
about how blind he is, and it's it has a kind of wonderful nature to it, and I love martial arts movies, and I spent years practicing martial arts. I still practice martial arts, and I think that there's a kinesthetic truth that is communicated, not not in a highbrow kind of way. And just because it's not highbrow doesn't mean it's not legitimate. And I
yeah. I
thought
mean, you
there's,
said that it's not high storytelling, but like I know from my friends who are really into wrestling that like that's all wrestling is storytelling.
you,
So
you know,
it is, you're right that it's not considered highbrow, but it's certainly all storytelling,
there's
you
a
know.
great essay by French cultural theorist Roland Barthes about how pro wrestling is the ultimate extension of Greek tragic theater. And
I
and is much closer to, and he wrote that in the 80s, and is much closer to what the Greeks would have enjoyed as their entertainment, uh, and can be considered the contemporary equivalent. And I think it's true, but there's no way to deal with that in a role playing game that exists now. So I had to make it,
okay.
and part of
So
it
what's your
was
solution?
and part of it was like having experienced physical conflict, and having been in fights, there was no role-playing game that felt like being in a fight. And I do my homework. Like I dive into every antecedent of the concept of what I want to tackle. You know, I went out and played Eric Wujic's Ninjas and Super Spies. I went out and really dove into what was behind the monk in D&D and how was that being structured. And the problem was it was so heavily abstracted,
Yeah,
the
it's
behavior.
a lot of plus one
So it,
actions, a lot
yeah,
of plus
exactly.
one
So
bonuses.
there was no intrinsic difference between a monk's abilities and just another set of superpowers, you know? So how do you make it feel like fighting? What I came down to was, like as all things are, is something of an artistic compromise to try and emulate the greater purpose, which was a system of trumping moves. So kind of like rock paper scissors, you know, your punch is beaten out by a kick, which is beaten out by a grapple, which can be beaten out by a punch. But then you've got defensive moves that work in there too, and you kind of program a sequence of moves for your. I don't know if how rough and tumble you are, Matthew, if you've been getting into a lot of street fights since you were a teenager. But you know, you're
Very
about
much
to
the
head
opposite.
into an exchange. You kind of think you kind of plan a few moves ahead,
Okay,
right?
right. It's like the scene in
Yeah,
the first the Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movie where he's like, "Well, first I'm going to punch him here, and then I'm going to sidestep, and then I'm going to do this," and he plays it all
yeah,
out in slow motion,
yeah.
and then he does all those things, and the guy falls on the ground.
Yeah, except you know that when you know that no plan survives contact with the enemy, right? So you're
Sure.
gonna, to paraphrase Tacitus, you know that it's not gonna work longer than a move or two. So you start each combat round by collecting uh three moves. You just write down three moves. I think I'm gonna punch, I'm gonna block, and maybe I'll punch again. No, I'll kick. And then you can issue them in any order in response to your opponent's moves. So it keeps it compact, and then it has a resolution. If you run out of moves and they've still got aggressive moves, you're going to get hit. So there's a back and forth that is kept short and, if you'll excuse the pun, punchy,
Hmm.
uh, so that other people around the table, you know, don't drift, so that it feels engaging. And then it's just 2 out of 3 rounds, even if it's like a horrible "you killed my mother" violent conflict, because those rounds don't have to be conceptualized in a formal environment. They're just like an exchange. I also have a deep, deep love of Shaw Brothers kung fu movies that I'm drawing on here. So that's like conflict. That's physical conflict. And I wanted to make sure people were as fragile as people are fragile, but like getting into a fight feels risky. And then for the emotional content, I was like, how do I make this Jean-Claude Van Damme scene happen?
Hmm.
Basically, I'm oversimplifying to a certain extent. There's lots of inspirations going on there,
Sure.
but so I have a list of comforts of people, places, and things
Mm.
that the character cares about, and to feed into the genre and its conventions, though, that's the impetus of play. That those are the things that get put on the chopping block. If you have a cat that you love, okay, well, the cat's been kidnapped. There's that's what's going to happen this year. If
Mm.
you have a diner that you love going to, oh no, somebody's hitting up the diner for protection money. If you have a brother, oh no, the brother's got bad gambling debts and there are people after him. You know, so every game starts off with something is under threat, and you need to resolve what is under threat. Because if you just have a bunch of White Wolf's Street Fighter 2 game, people love that game because they love making characters, but nobody knows what to do when they made their characters because there's no structure to other than having people get into one-on-one street fights.
Right.
So so what do? Oh, well, we've got to go help our friend because his brother's been is has got bad gambling debts and there are people after him. And his structure is under threat and bad things are going to happen on the character sheet if it doesn't resolve. And so driving the narrative of the game forward. I don't know if narrative is the right word, but driving the action forward
Yeah.
through uh, through companionship, through camaraderie, proved to be that solution. So and then trying to tighten that design down to what is strictly necessary in order to make this happen. And then I really love Greg Stafford's King Arthur Pendragon as a
Mm.
game, because it's got this wonderful idea of, yeah, you're your character. You have a character. You're just embodying one character. But can we step outside that a little bit? Like when the character dies, can you be the character's heir or successor or daughter or whatever else? And I really wanted to piggyback on that because action doesn't have to happen. You get into a fight, oh, and then you get into another fight, oh, and then you get into another fight. No, no, like we can stretch out this experience to reflect, oh, it's fall of 1942, and this happens, and then maybe you don't see that person again until like 57 or something, and you've been through a lot of other things
Sure.
between now and then, and it was in like 4 years ago when you broke your arm and it never quite healed, and like trying to hit the right tone of real life sucks. I sneezed the wrong way and my back hurts. And trying to capture a little bit, just a little bit of like the sweaty hyper reality, like you roundhouse kick somebody in the face, fun, matching those ideas together on a platform that can operate and emulate them effectively. So that was the design challenge. And
And, and do you think you, I mean, I'm sure you did, but like, did you feel you got to the design challenge?
yeah,
Does Fight
I
to Survive
definitely,
provide what you were trying to do?
it does. It's diceless, which scares some people off, but it is a unique experience. And what I wanted to do was pioneer a unique experience that you would have that would feel relevant and interesting. And it's a game because I didn't want it to be a one-off game. There's nothing wrong with one-off games, but I wanted it to be something that built, and it builds. Like you develop, because you're identifying your comforts, you're identifying what's important to you. Like my having cherry pie is important to me, or reading paperback novels is important to me, or whatever. And those are the things that are being engaged with by the GM, because I'm a lazy GM and I really want to be able to kind of couch myself in procedure if possible, and then use that as the kind of home base for launching creativity. Uh, but because you're presenting those things as players, the story's about you. Like it's about you and your things, and you are creating that world, and you're in charge of shepherding it in kind of a compartmentalizing aspect. And lots of role playing games have a kind of conceptual compartmentalization. Dungeons and Dragons is a good example because it gives players a lot of stuff for their characters, so that it offloads it off the GM having to know everything about their characters.
Right,
So it's
right.
kind of a self, like it's a really good example of compartmentalization. Um, and so I wanted to compartmentalize in that way so that the player, because I want to be a fan of my players, so the
Hmm.
players are invested in their stuff. They're like, oh, my cat, I love this cat. We've gone through, I don't know why I keep going back to the cat, but
Yeah.
like we've
Cat
gone
and
through
cherry
so much
pie.
with the cat. Um, so you get a shared sense of history. The longer you play, the more deep and interesting that history is. And people get really, really invested in what's going on in that history. And so ultimately, it's a game about martial artists that is about heroism, but also the frailty of the human condition, and about kind of what happens over time, over long periods of time. Like I've been in games that have lasted decades of in-game years, and things change and grow, and eventually you might reach the point at which you have to say, I need to step away from this violent lifestyle. And oh, but this character that I've been showing a little bit of karate to on the side for the last 12 years, he's finally ready to take his place at the head of my dojo. And you get what I'm always trying to capture in games, and this is just one game. Fight to Survive is just one game. It's not like
Sure.
the pinnacle of all things. But what I'm always trying to capture is um, tricking people and tricking myself into feeling like this is important.
Hmm.
Like the things that are going on are meaningful, you know?
So I like that. I like that. Because yeah, it is sort of like, why do you know the four pieces of paper that make up like my character and the history of my character is just four pieces of paper and a story that I told. It doesn't, it's not important, but it is sort of like, but it is if you decide it is, kind of thing. Um I want to ask you. I've already forgotten. I've already forgotten what you just said, but it was the exact wording about like tricking your brain into thinking it's important, and picking up a thread that you mentioned earlier, about the game happening in your mind versus the game happening on the table. And I want
Yeah,
to
well,
use
the real game, like the real, it's kind of like a panopticon without an eye, right? Because the game that's happening in player one's head and the game that's happening in player two's head, and et cetera, they're all playing a different game. And sometimes this is radically true. Like sometimes Dungeons and Dragons is an effective kitchen sink because you have somebody who's kind of power gaming over here, and you have somebody who's like doing amateur theater over here, and you have somebody who, and they can all kind of exist at the same table. I find that indie games with a narrower design focus can sometimes not accommodate that such an eclectic approach of people coming in. I'm not glorifying Dungeons and Dragons at all, but I'm just saying like that is its kitchen sink approach
Yeah,
does
it's
have
a
certain
it's
benefits.
a big tent and a lot of
Yeah,
stuff fits in it, but
and
like
that's a good example of how broad the idea can be of people are playing different games. But
mhm.
it actually, I don't want to invest too much in phenomenology, but the perception you're sharing a social contract of juggling multiple, sometimes contradictory perceptions of what's going on. And as much as I love what's in the text and I love like publishing, the act of play is a whole nother dimension. And
So
it's a shared experience that I want to put as many hooks in as possible to try and facilitate that happening properly from a design perspective. And by properly, I just mean to theme, like
yeah.
to a goal, to an artistic endeavor.
So the transition point here though that I want to invite you to talk about your current project, uh, which is a solo version, as I understand it, of everything that you've just talked about. So like the social aspect is removed, the different games in different people's heads aspect that you talked about is eliminated because there's only one person in one head because you're playing a solo game. So like, is it correct that the solo Marshall Blues, right, is the name, and it's an iteration, a version, a different implementation of Fight to Survive, or is it just sort of thematically related? And then how do you was that the design, the next design challenge was to do all the same things that you were excited about doing, but do it by yourself? Like, is that
I mean, it was a challenge. Embarrassingly, I'll tell you how it started, which was I when I did the Kickstarter for Fight to Survive, which was 2 years ago, almost to the day. I flippantly was like, "Oh, people like solo games. I'll just include that as a stretch goal, whatever."
right?
And then when it was hit, I was like, "Oh, let's focus on getting the main game packaged and getting it to printers, and let's not worry about this right now." And then by the time I had to worry about the solo game, I realized it wasn't going to work. Like, this is not going to work. This is not the same game. Because I had set up Fight to Survive to one of the main considerations. Video games are very different because video games are largely one player games, right? And
Right.
so everything you happens filters through a single character. And a lot of the things that we think of in other mediums, like movies, are effectively one player character kind of notions.
Huh.
And so it was a challenge in designing Fight to Survive to be like, why do you even need each other? Why do you need to be around each other? I was playing the Fallout role playing game by Modifius recently, and I don't know if you how much you know Fallout, but the characters are really interesting, but they're really interesting and entirely separate unto themselves. You don't have a reason to be together. You don't have a reason to go adventuring together. And I'm not trying to make problems. When I say that, it's just you all have to kind of suspend disbelief and be like, oh, okay, well, we're a party. We've got to be able to play this game,
Right. You
right?
look like a trustworthy adventurer. Join us.
Exactly. It's just like the old Dungeons and Dragons adage of like, don't split the party. It's not in the rules, but we all kind of know that the game doesn't really work if people are off wandering separate from each other because it becomes just on a logistics perspective hard to play. There are other games where you can effectively do that, like, and it's accommodated within the rules. But it would just break the structure of it. So I had to figure out ways of like, why do you need each other at all? Like, how can you depend on each other, and how is it mechanically advantageous to do that? Because if you don't have mechanical reinforcement behind an idea, it will eventually fall away in the practice of play because things that are just kind of suggestions get forgotten eventually, even by well-meaning people. So it needs to have a reason to be there, uh, or it will be discarded. So the exchange between player characters was a huge part of the game. And if I'm going to take that out, what is the driving force? What is the narrative, or what is the not narrative, but what is pulling you forward?
Hmm.
What is
Hmm.
your motivating factor? So I had to redesign a lot of the structure. The fights are the same, in that you're comparing punches and kicks and blocks and stuff, and you have comforts, but the comforts had to be dug, like the comforts are predetermined and dug right into the structure. The other thing I wanted to avoid was writing a novel. I don't want to write a novel. Like nobody wants to read my novel. Uh, I don't want to write one. But it really got me excited doing this about um, how much design space there is untouched in solo games specifically. Like I went out and went over Iron Sword and Thousand Year Old Vampire and all this stuff, and I decided like all the hits, and
Yeah.
decided what I didn't want to do with story prompts because I don't. It's not that I just can't. I find it difficult to engage in story games because I find it difficult to find a reason to believe. It's hard for me to feel grounded in the content and care if things feel a little bit arbitrary to me.
Mm.
So I need solid stakes, and if I need solid stakes, then I'm trying to design around those solid stakes. So story prompts for me are a little bit too open ended. Like somebody says, "Oh, imagine you've been betrayed." I'm like, I don't know who's betrayed me. Like, it's hard for me to like. I don't want to connect the dots. Instead, so it needed to be a little bit more grounded. What it ended up as was something between a kind of fight simulator and a choose your own adventure, which was in, and I'm trying to make it as short and punchy as possible in like little descriptions. So it's not just me like going on about oppressive capitalism, and actually has some kind of weight to it. And I avoided in Fight to Survive giving a pretty heavy lore.
Mm.
I didn't want a section like I have done other books where it was just like all lore.
Right.
Like I
Yeah.
did a book called Celtic Cyclopedia for Pendlehaven that was just um, Celtic history as a
Yeah.
background to the game. And because there was just so much lore to deal with, and I was project manager and I did a bunch of editing on that, and it just made me think like, how many people are reading lore in role playing game books? You always have a minority of people who are obsessed with the world and will read every word, right?
Hmm.
But most of your players won't even read the book. They'll just read like where their character class is, maybe, and
Right.
maybe their like special abilities or spells or whatever it is. So you have to regard, as much as I love publishing, that a lot of it is an oral tradition. So I wanted to try and not have a lore chapter in Fight to Survive. I wanted to make sure that it was referential and springboarding. So I snuck in the kind of NPCs and world building in photo captions. So because I had to make the photographs anyway, so I made them about specific people, and I designed and I had a chart of like 100 characters throughout this 100-year history that were going to be featured in these photographs. And so you can kind of piece together 100 years of history by reading the photo captions
Yeah.
and
That's a fun way
throughout
to
the
do it.
structure. Well, it provided like really interesting and imaginative art too, right? Because no, that's not just some guy punching some guy. That's the big event in 1932 when
Right.
this boxer upset the gambling, right? So it becomes
Did you read Kyle Stark's Rock Candy Mountain comic? Do you know that one?
no, I'm sorry.
It's a lot of it's a lot of hobo fights.
Okay,
It's you know, anyway, that's check that out. That's fun. That's because
okay.
I was about to reference like there's a character named 100 Cat because he fights like 100 cats, and so that's
I don't want to fight 100 cats.
exactly. Nobody wants to fight 100 Cat, and that's like, but that joke in one panel of that page is that's what you're talking about, where it's like you immediately know how that fight would have gone because you've put a evocative name on it or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get
Well,
what you mean.
trying to synthesize things down to a brevity, like to the briefest possible snippet to a picture, because and part of why I did that is because I didn't want the NPCs getting in the way of the player characters. Because
Sure.
the way the mechanics work, it's about the player characters. And I did not want that being overshadowed. Like Vampire the Masquerade is a great example, where people feel like the meta narrative or the superstructure of the game completely overshadowed their player characters, and you've got reams and reams and reams of lore. And so I wanted the lore to facilitate play, not to interfere with play. So now that I'm doing a solo book, I have to actually write something about what happened. So I had all these ideas that I knew what the events were, uh, but now I have to like kind of write out how they did it and put you in the driver's seat
Right. So when you say
as
it's
the
a
protagonist. Yeah.
so when you say it's a choose your own adventure, like it is interesting because I've played Ironsworn and Thousand Year Old Vampire, and I enjoy how open ended they are. I guess I'm more apt to write a novel than you are. I guess I don't know, but like I like how they just sort of like point you in a direction and say go do it, resolve this role result however you want. Um, so I find it interesting that your solution to that is that like now you have to write sort of a novel, but then like so there's like a series of events, like a dramatic, like I guess tell me if I'm right? Like you describe it as a choose your own adventure. There is sort of a plot that happens, and then what you're doing as the solo game part of it is figuring out how your character got through that or contributed to that or made what turned out to be the center of those events or something. Is that what you're describing, or
Well,
is
I
it
mean,
I misunderstood?
kind of, yes. So part of the theme of it is that it's a dirty world, it's a rough and tumble world, and like there's a nature of oppression to that, and knowing your limitations. And so whether or not you get into a mugging on the street, and whether or not you get roughed up or you come out on top is a big part of your journey, which is just facilitated through the text. Because there's a point at which you can either leave through being too beat up, or leave the book, or you can leave the book from quitting. Like there's a hardship measure that you're just like, you know what, forget about this. And I remember early in the playtesting, one of the characters that you interact with is a your best friend, who is a girl named Judy Herrera, who's the fighting schoolgirl Judy Herrera. And she takes you out to a diner because it takes place in the 1950s for a milkshake, and says, "Listen, like you're just not tough enough. You're just a milksop, and I'm gonna toughen you up." And the act of doing that, the act of her doing that, gives you hardship. And I hadn't been tracking my hardship very well. And I went right up to quitting. And I was like, you know what, Judy? Forget about this. Forget about you. I'm out of here. I don't want to do this. Like the life just became too hard. It became too stressful. So I'm in a roundabout way, I'm saying you're not reading a story and choosing where the story is. In designing, I'm trying to find the line of how much engagement is coming from the reader and just fueling the imagination. So rather than it being an open-ended story prompt, it's a kind of a guided story prompt of reflect on what this means. And the text is inviting you constantly to reflect on what it means to have your comforts challenged, and what it means
Mm-hmm.
to reconcile with them, and what it means to fight for what you care about or fight for what you believe in. And it's constantly calling on you to say, are you going to fight for this, or are you just going to move on to this page? And it's the moment of decision as the reader or the player where the real action happens. Like, is this something I want to care about?
Mm.
There's a bit in the book where there's a burning building, and you have to run in and rescue someone. And every floor, you're given the option of like, do you leave and live for another day, or do you go up another floor and probably die? And like that is the chilling, like that's the part of investment. That's the chilling part where you're like, ah, oh God, I don't know. Well, I managed to find that family. Maybe this is enough for me. And I've had people, because I had to do up, like I did up the first 124 pages to release to Kickstarter backers as part of the solo, and then this crowdfunder is, um, I get to do the rest of the years, which I'd already planned out,
Mm.
and have 10 years of content. And I've already had people emailing me being like, that was too traumatizing. I don't want to do that ever again. And can you please finish the rest of the book? Like,
Well,
uh,
well, that's good that they want to finish it, even if it was too traumatizing. I mean, that does sound it does sound very dramatic. Like I having it doesn't sound like any of the solo games that I have played. So I think you have achieved that. As far as like, you know, are you tough enough to turn the page is kind of a really great hook of like a both as a storytelling conceit or a storytelling thing, but also like physical product kind of thing. Like is it set up as like a 2-page spread, and that's sort of like, that act of turning the page is like, is this the last page you see, or is it one page, like, because that is really dramatic, like, the old listen along books, and they play the chime when you turn the page and those kind of things. So like they're that sort of like physical act of you turning the page as a player is emotionally and linked to like the character moving on. Is that, did you get it down to exactly that, or again, have I invented something that isn't in there?
Well, it's if I get your meaning, it's pretty close. Like
Okay.
you need to make the choice. Are you going to go, like, just to narrow in on the one example, are you going to go back down that ladder and leave the burning building and
Yeah.
accept that the person you wanted to save might be on some higher floor and you just couldn't do it? And
Right.
how are you going to, and are you going to live with yourself having not done that? Because bravery doesn't mean much if there aren't stakes. And we're pretty flip with the idea of bravery in role playing games because it's all imaginary and whatever. So sure, I jump off the bridge and on top of the
I
back of
take
the
my
giant
potion of
eagle, and
heroism, and now I
yeah,
have +4 to
exactly.
all my actions.
But when you feel like you might lose something, even if it's conceptual, right?
Right.
Even if it's your sense of self, then it feels like it matters. Because I was trying, Matthew, to get at what would really make me engage even if I didn't want to.
Mm,
What would make me really feel like that this matters, that this has some weight to it. And I don't want, like, you can write a novel. I don't want to write a novel. To I want to help the player have an experience, and because that's more important, I think. And the kind of experience that you could have with these prompts and making these choices, which are supposed to be as hard as possible. There's hard choices. Not to be like masochistic. It's not. It's because sometimes the choice is just, do you go home and go to bed because you need to at some point.
right.
Um, and I'm fascinated with the fact that what's really going on and what's really important is what's inside the player's head, and how can I make that as an effective a process as possible so that I'm not just expecting them to follow along. I'm expecting them to engage and to feel.
Mm,
And I don't think that would be achieved by a novel. Like, yes, you can do that on a novel, like, but this has an opportunity as a medium to do this in a really special and unique way. And I think people are waking up to not to sing the praises of solo games, because it's interesting. It's a subgenre, and they're really cool. But like, I think Thousand Year Old Vampire and Iron Sword specifically really woke people up to the idea of like, oh, I can have a different kind of experience. Like this can be a different way of interacting with text, um, and it can have an emotional resonance. And people care. People care about what experiences result from going through that,
mm,
just like they care about playing with their friends and, oh, it was so cool, my friend did something really cool in the game the other night and it was so cool and you had to be there, and the story doesn't make any hardly sense and certainly doesn't have any emotional resonance when people retell these things because it has to do with investment. So how do you foster investment when it's just you in the text?
yeah.
That becomes an interesting prospect, an interesting design prospect. And certainly, how do you do it to bring out a certain kind of genre and certain themes and certain like attitudes?
Yeah. It is such an interesting, it's an interesting puzzle to solve that I think you've solved it in a very interesting way. I think the other, again, like talking about just my own experiences, like I like, because this video is sort of part of a series of solo game interviews, sort of, very loosely, but it is sort of like, I think the investment when you're given loose prompts and you get to write whatever you want is that, like, well, that's the story that I'm writing, and you've got kind of concepts of where things are going to go, and then do the random rolls, then support what you were trying to do. And it is sort of like you've decided who your character is and what your character wants at the creation part. Um, so to access all of those feelings in a different way is interesting. I'm intrigued. I'm gonna have to try and
Yeah, and
get. get this game and see it a different way to experience a solo game.
And
It's
I'm not knocking that structure at all, like
right,
at
right,
all, because I think it's super interesting and super legit. But I think they're getting back to what we were saying earlier. There's just a lot of design territory we can go over.
right.
And myself personally, I always want the designer to be smarter than me. I want the because I could just go write a novel. Like I've done enough writing that if that's what I wanted to do, I could be doing. So why am I playing this instead of writing a novel, or why
Right.
am I doing this instead of a
Well,
story
it's
prompting exercise? Um,
well,
I,
I mean, I think it's like that it's hard to be the one to make all the choices in the story if you're writing the novel. Like you sit down with the page and you've got your character, you've got your dramatis personae at the beginning, and you know the characters you're doing. Like, because I do the NaNoWriMo. This past year was the first year I didn't do NaNoWriMo for like a decade and a half. Kind of sad about it, but it was. But yeah, I mean, you keep saying write a novel, and like I think what any solo game takes away from the writing the novel process is like you don't have to make as many decisions about what happens next. It's because that's the dice roll or the card mechanic or the you look up the prompt and it tells you, it is very different from writing a novel, I guess. But I don't know.
another way. Sorry, you're just making me think. Another way that it is very different than writing a novel. A novel a novel's merit is largely held in the reader and not in the act of writing. Certainly, um, the way we think of novel publishing, but the act of creation is the point of interest for a solo game, even if it's just based on writing prompts. Like it is the joy of discovering in yourself what happens next that
Mm,
has the merit. It doesn't matter if the ink disappears as soon as you write it down and it's gone. The joy of play it is the real bread and butter of the experience. Like you're not going to go back to your 1,000-year-old vampire game and read it all. And if you are, you're going to go back to read it all to remember how you felt when you were writing it,
right.
which is a completely different direction to go at it than the a novel or a short story, which is supposed to kind of metatextual aspects aside, is supposed to stand on its own in terms of an experience. And somebody who's not there is supposed to have that experience. There is no intention for people to go out and publish their Iron Sword experience, right?
Right. You'd have to clean it up into like a novel, like if you did that.
Exactly. And and maybe there should be like in Japan in the 80s, I don't know if you're an anime person, but Records of the Lotus War, for instance, was
Oh,
an anime that was published
I
as a
am familiar
replay.
that exists.
Yeah, well, it was just a series of replays that were published, and replays were just transcriptions of somebody's Dungeons and Dragons game.
Hmm.
And they would, and at the time, it was published because people were reading it for fun. And I think it's very interesting to me that what has caught on in the last while is watching other people play role playing games.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have a culture of reading other people's role playing games. And we could. There's this little aspect of this little blip that happened in the 80s in Japan that was just that. Uh, so maybe people could publish their Iron Sword uh, adventures, but I don't think that detracts from the fact that the real uh, substance of it is the act of doing it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the thing that makes it hard to write a game. What's the system? You were talking before about like the being smarter than the player. And I mean, I don't know about smarter, but like it is sort of
Yeah,
like
maybe smart isn't the right word, but yeah.
but the designing some sort of system that mitigates whatever, either you've got a bunch of prompts pre-written that are delivered in an interesting way, or you've got a bunch of free-form stuff that you access through some sort of random thing, or a gated flowchart sort of process, like our traditional choose your own path sort of not storytelling. Building that is the act of creation, and then people play it is a different
It's a different,
is
yeah,
a
it's a different
culmination of it. It's
consideration, certainly. And I think a lot of it has to do with the act of anticipation, because I don't want to run into, as a player, I don't want to run into invisible walls, whether
mm,
it's in a I mean, people allow it
Ooh,
in video games, but like conceptual invisible walls are the death of verisimilitude.
sure.
And
Yeah, I agree. There's some of the solo games that I've played, like they were like, you can do whatever you want, except this next prompt assumes that you made different choices than you actually made, and it's like, oh well, that
yeah, people can accept a certain amount of wiggling room. Like it's no different than, oh, we have to keep the party together because it's going to be hard on the GM if we don't. But if you can bake in incentives to steer it with a gentle hand on the till, uh, then I think that is usually leads to a stronger or more investing experience than
yeah,
having to regard invisible walls.
yeah. Uh all right, we've talked a bunch. It's been a while. I don't know. There's certainly more topics that we could talk about. One thing that I want to make sure that we talk about a little bit is the where is solo Marshall Blues available? Where is it? Like we talked about you said Crowdfundr, but like, is there anything? Tell us more. Tell us more about the campaign itself.
Yeah. So the crowdfunder, and that's as you would expect it to be spelled, except there's no final E. It's Fundr. Uh, Crowdfunder, and
Because
it's
it's
on
an app or it's a website, so
yeah,
it's gotta have a funky spelling.
it's gotta be cute, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can go to crowdfunder.com and look up solo Marshall Blues that way. Solo, there's nothing unique about that spelling, I don't think. No, solo Marshall Blues. And the campaign is launching on February 1st, 2024, and running until March 1st, 2024. So
Excellent.
it's a month long. It's part of the Crowdfunder's Tabletop Nonstop event where they're doing a bunch of promotion, like extra promotion and fanfare for tabletop projects. Um, they're a nice group of people. I'm Canadian and they're in Canada, so I was like, yeah, I'll hop on board the CanCon wagon and do this with you. Which you sacrifice the eyes of a larger platform like Kickstarter, but I think the space can afford more competition. So here I am, trying to fund a tabletop role playing game on a smaller platform like Crowdfunder. Because
Yeah.
working with people, good people, is more important, I think, a
I
lot
mean,
of the times.
all right. Well, James, I think we've had a lovely conversation. I think it's gone too long, and I may have to cut some parts out, but I think
Oh,
we've said a lot of
please,
interesting things.
yeah, take a
And
hatchet to it. I'm happy for you to do that. I I was just enjoying talking to you, really. Like the
sure.
thing is, it's so good to connect, and I wonder sometimes how many people are in the industry, in the tabletop role
Mm,
playing game industry? How many people are active in the industry, and how many people are sitting back and just kind of lurking? Which, no discredit to the idea of lurking. Like, people enjoy things in different ways, and they absorb things at different rates, and participate in many different ways. And one
sure.
incredibly legitimate way, as far as I'm concerned, is to kind of peer in the window,
Mm,
and look
yeah.
in on something. And I think that's why it's important to produce. That's why it's important to get things out. That's why it's important to get them out of your closet and dusted off and published on the internet and in print, is because you never know what you're sharing, and you
Mm,
never know the impact what you're sharing is going to have. Like, Never Going Home Again is a good example for me. Like, even before I opened the book, I already had run my imagination had already run wild about what this means. And that, like, that's an experience that is special and is communicated. And if you hadn't had the tenacity to publish, I would never have had that experience.
sure. Yeah. I
So
mean, it's yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Um, yeah, it's tenacity to publish is, I think, as we talked about I said the pyramid earlier in this conversation, but yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to make something at all. It's hard to make it presentable. It's hard to then jump through all of the hoops to to sell it, and it's hard to do another one after that because you to build up that momentum is a whole other. I mean, all of it is hard. All of it is hard. So,
all of it's
uh,
hard, and I think it's important not to make a value judgment on
ex-
just because you published one doesn't mean you have to publish two. Like,
sure,
this could be the thing that you've done, and
right.
that is great.
Well,
And
and
you
just
know.
experiencing and supporting other people that like, I just want to read all the games, I just want to play them, is participation in the industry.
I'm so happy to participate in the industry. I'm so happy that we have the industry that we do. I could not be farther away from Ben Riggs' idea that tabletop role playing games are dead. Because
I think that's been I don't think that's what he said, but
sorry, the golden age of tabletop role playing games is dead
I
is the very title
well,
of his video.
I I won't try to pretend that I won't. I don't know. I don't know. I don't
Sorry,
need
I'm
to
sorry. I
defend
don't
Ben
mean to put
Riggs.
you in a corner. Just my
I don't
point
need to
is,
defend Ben Riggs. He's got his own podcast that he can tell you exactly what he said on. But yeah, I mean, I think there's. I mean, golden ages are fiction made up anyway. That like there was never a golden age. Like now is the age, and I think his point is that things will change, but nobody. I don't think it knows. I think we will find out whether or not the current industry is underpinned by Dungeons and Dragons or not if Dungeons and Dragons goes away. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. I don't think anyone knows because I think there's a lot of arguments that it isn't, but we don't know. I think that's where I am with that. But yeah, I think it's true that there's such energy. Like we were talking about the pyramid, right? There's Dungeons and Dragons is a big part of the industry, but there is so much energy that's outside of that as well, which I think is what you were saying.
yeah, that's the point I was just trying to make is, when I open up Here We Used to Fly, for instance, it blows my mind.
Mm.
It makes me challenge what a game can be, what tabletop role playing games can be, can what you can do. Like it's like 80 pages, like what you could publish. Um, how much do you have to put into something? How much prompt it requires to spark imagination, and what a play experience has to look like, right? And that's this year. And so long as things are being published that it I don't want to be highfalutin and say advance the medium, but like
Mm.
really hack up what is possible, then I think the industry is great.
Yeah, yeah. It seems certainly seems healthy. As far as the creativity is not what's under threat.
Like there's some sustainability problems. There's some expectation problems in terms of workload for publishing. There's some problems of pay scale. There's every
Every industry has, yeah.
every industry has things usually coming down to money. It's
Mm-hmm.
whatever the industry is. It's a um,
Right.
but I don't know. I worked for years in non for profit, and I'm really excited about how much the tabletop role playing game industry gets done without money. Just I want to see people paid for art because art is valuable,
Sure.
unquestionably. But hey, isn't it neat how many cool things just come out of people's brains from
Yeah.
their like just in their spare time because they're bored at work and
Right.
that actually change the landscape of the industry, that
Mm.
actually matter in terms of uh people talk about how I think so foolishly about how everything in tabletop role playing games has already been done, and
Oh,
I
well,
I cannot disagree more about that. I'm we are worlds away from each other in our stance. Is we're still sparking such creativity and joy on somebody's tweet, like somebody tweets something and it just changes everything. Like
yeah.
what a wild and wonderful
Uh,
uh
there's a
experience that is.
I'm this is it's bigger than a tweet, but I'm on one of the game design groups I'm on. Like there's a couple people who are always like just finding the weirdest pictures from the internet, and they're like, "What's this game? Like, what is if this what inspires the game?" And like people will chime in with like paragraphs, just one paragraph each. Like, "Oh, this is a game about this." "Oh, this is a game about something completely different." Like there's such yeah, there's so many worlds to explore yet that have not yet so many games that have not yet been written, for sure, for sure.
All
um
the books that I haven't written. Yeah.
sure. All right, we got to wrap this thing up. James, it's been great to talk to you. Before we leave, one last thing: where can people find more about you? Tell us your crowdfunder once more. Where are you on the internet?
I
Where are
have an
your games?
internet website at radiojamesgames.com, which hyperlinks around to all the places you might want to be. And one of them is a crowdfunder campaign that goes live on February 1st for solo martial blues. I think it's a unique experience, a unique martial arts solo experience. Um, whether or not it all holds together is a fight you're going to have with me. Uh, but but I think it's pretty cool. And there are other games. My other principal game is Fight to Survive role playing martial arts meets hard. I guess I won't plug all the games of the past, but that's
But
I
you can
really
find it
I'm
from there.
sorry. I don't mean to keep this going, Matthew. I my urge I have such an urge to publish smaller games, like 50-page games, like 10 of them, like
Yeah,
just like litter the internet.
I mean,
Uh but
there are multiple successful Patreons where people are doing exactly that. Like, just give me your $5 a month, and I'll give you a game. And that's either the main line or the sideline. There's plenty of that out there. So
see,
do it,
look at the
do it.
cool things. Look at the cool new things going on. Like these cool new models. Like that's a distribution model. That is a whole new distribution model that did not exist 10 years ago in human history.
Sure.
I mean, it has similarities to subscription models from anyway. Like
Yeah,
we could go on. We could go on. I'm
we
sorry.
could, and we might. But I think I'm going to cut the call off here. And once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for talking about all the stuff about your games and your thoughts about the universe. And thank you, everyone, for watching this video.